My name is Rajiv Satyal. Welcome to our show, What Do You Bring to the Table? And I am so thrilled to be sitting here or across from or in my screen somewhere in my computer from Kal Penn. How are you doing, Kal?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
This is super cool. I appreciate that you admired, as we were prepping for this, the photo of you I have.
Oh yeah, no, I have 5 of them in the other room, so I'm glad that you have the one that I sent you.
So you've got 2 big projects coming out. One is a feature film on Comedy Central called Hot Mess Holiday. It stars, in fact, another person in this picture, Melanie Chandra, Serena Jindal, and you are the executive producer. Is that right?
I'm one of the exec producers, yes. So these 2 wonderful, extremely talented, very funny ladies, I met, I want to say it's been 3 years now. It was right before, maybe even longer than that, actually. No, it was about 3 years. Before the pandemic, and I'd watched their short that they did called Serena and Mel. We have some mutual friends, and I was like, I gotta meet them. I want to know what the deal is. Why isn't this a movie? Why isn't this a TV show? And it turned out that they were already developing it to try to turn it into that. And I said, well, I don't need to third wheel this, but if you ever want another EP on board to help develop and try to get this thing sold and made, I would love to do it. And it just so happened that they were looking to add somebody to the project. So it was great. It's got like, Bridesmaids vibes, I think, in a lot of ways. And they're just so funny. I'm so glad that this is finally out there. I did a piss poor job of telling you what it's about. I just told you about my emotional and comedy connection to these 2 incredible women. It's it's a Diwali movie. It's a Comedy Central Diwali movie that takes place during, the broader holidays, during Christmas and New Year and all that. But it very quickly derails from a really nice Diwali movie into essentially a diamond heist. And that's what I mean when it's like, oh, Bridesmaids seems very wholesome at first, and then it just quickly goes off the rails into very funny, bizarre comedy, which is why this is on Comedy Central and not Lifetime.
Yes, it makes sense that it would go off the rails. It sounds like it's that Bridesmaids meets Help with the Beatles, right? So they go off on this strange adventure with diamonds and pearls and everything else, which is wild. So, and maybe you are the third wheel, Kal, because I've seen the picture of you guys in a rickshaw, and in an auto rick, I think there is a third wheel. So you fit in perfectly as that.
Fair. Thank you.
Fair enough. The other thing I really want to talk to you about, of course, is your book. You Can't Be Serious. Not to creep you out, I listened to the entire thing yesterday.
Awesome. Oh, right on, man. Thank you. Well, I narrated it myself for that reason. I wanted to make sure the jokes and everything landed in the right ways. Years ago, this was probably 10 years ago, I took this little sabbatical from acting for about 2 years, worked for President Obama. And when I was leaving the White House, my manager, my acting manager, I've only had one my entire career. He's a great guy. He called me and said, "Hey man, you should write a book." I was like, why would I write a book? Because literally nobody has ever gone from being an actor to working in politics. And I said to him, the governor of California is Arnold Schwarzenegger. That is a completely false statement. I appreciate the sentiment. And I love you, but that is a completely false statement. Also, like Ronald Reagan, he's like, okay, elected office, fine. But his point was like, you should write a book. And I said, that's not why I did this. I didn't go to work at the White House to write a book about it. And years went by, probably 4 years. And then I had this sort of, I wouldn't call it an epiphany, but I kind of thought maybe I do actually have a story to tell, because I have had this incredibly blessed journey of yes, of course, I've worked my butt off, and I'm very proud of the work that I put in, especially early in my acting career, and dodging barriers to entry and navigating, racism that's way more explicit than it is nowadays. And I thought, I want to write a book for 2 sets of people. So like little brown kid who's trying to navigate just what life is. And the second set of people I'd like to write a book for is anybody out there who's ever had more than one passion. So just the notion that I could make stoner movies and work for President Obama is not actually that different from what most people feel. It used to be that back in the day, pick one thing, stay in your lane, and that's it. And nowadays it's like whatever your passions are, and it can be plural and multiple. The world is not made up of mutually exclusive entities, which is not to say you're not going to struggle with those passions and trying to get them off the ground. But I thought if that's been my experience, why not write a book and share that with like-minded people who, it's not a how-to book or a self-help book, but I guess has elements of that if you want to learn about my story and see how, kind of there might be some lessons in there. So I had a blast writing it. It was fun.
That totally translates. It totally tracks with my experience with it. And knowing that I was going to speak to you today informed my journey as I was reading it. It was such anticipation for me because it sounds like you were also a huge Catcher in the Rye fan. And it reminded me of the part where he goes, what really knocks me out is a book that when you're all done reading it, you wish that the author that wrote it was a terrific friend of yours and you can call him up on the phone and talk to him. And I was like, that's exactly what this is exactly what this feels like. So also on that note, so thank you for doing this. And you have a reputation as being a super nice guy. I know I've met you only a couple of times, but that totally is true. The fact that you're giving back to the community by doing this show, by doing so many things that you do to support is really, really amazing. And you can also tell because of the number of shout outs you give in the book. You really call people out by name, whether it's your manager, people with whom you grew up, Stephen Kasakov, I think it was, I saw in an interview, who was your teacher. And they asked him, well, did you have some idea that Kal Penn was going to be Kal Penn? And he's like, yeah, I knew. I think it would be so funny if he's like, no, I had no idea. He was just some jerk off. By the way, I think you should have used the word jerk off more, being from Jersey.
Yeah. Well, look, that was what you just said was exactly what I was hoping out of writing this, and why I did the audiobook myself. Is I just want the person listening to it or reading it to feel like we're just having a beer together, feel like we're spending time as friends, because it was important to me. So many people who have supported me over the years have, who I've never had the chance to meet, have been like friends to me, and I revere them for that support, and wanted to translate that into words. And I'm glad you brought up Kazakov. I mean, there are a lot of people from my past and present who I talk about in the book, and you probably also noticed the people who I don't mention by name, or rather whose names I changed into characters, are the ones who were those barriers to entry. The super racist director of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, for example.
Captain Moneybags.
Captain Moneybags was my boss at a movie studio when I was an intern, an unpaid intern in college. There's another guy, do I call him, Original Ideas McGee, who was the director of Son of the Mask, also.
Who had that crazy voice and was super annoying and...
Yeah, I mean, so people who, the reason that I don't, now look, of course, could you do 10 minutes of research into a chapter and go on IMDb and be like, I figured out the name of that person? Of course you could, but that's not the point of telling those stories. The point of telling those stories was to look at how systems change over time. And in this case, it's the industry that I love. I love what we do as actors and storytellers. I'm so glad that I have the chance to work in that industry. It wasn't always easy, and it will not be easy. That's just the nature of what it is. But to talk about how those things have changed, it was important to me to say, how do we talk about complex issues of race and identity and access to jobs in a way that is truthful but doesn't harp on one individual? Because I think if we harped on the one individual who was maybe mean to me, or was my barrier to entry, or was fully racist, and there are many in the book, if we harp on their names, then we're completely losing sight of the fact that this is part of a larger system. And if we really want to change those systems, looking at how those things actually plug in together. So I did go out of my way to make up fun, ridiculous names like Captain Moneybags for some of these greedy, awful, racist people, but also did go out of my way to give shout outs to people who were really helpful to me and who really meant a lot to me over the years, because I also wanted people to know their names,
I put together a solo show, a few of them, and one of them tracked my dating life. It was called No Man's Land, and it's very similar to Asif Manvi's title, that book that came out later, No Land's Man. And, you do composites. You go, look, this story may not be exactly the way the truth of it is there, of course, but just for sake of brevity and the book and entertainment, the way the story is told. Do you find, Kal, as a human being, that affects your memory? Because it did for me. Like when I went back and redid it, even though the authenticity was there, the thread was there, now I have to go, oh, I put those two girls together as a composite. One was Jane, one was Mandy, but I made them into Kelly. Does that happen to you as a person in real life? Or are you able to still sort out fact and fiction in your past?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because there's a disclaimer in the front of the book, and of course I have it with me because I'm on a book promo tour right now. Well, I guess it's blurred out because of the. By the way, the reason the back is blurred out is boxes and boxes of all of our this is the when you do a book, you do everything yourself. So even though, I've got a wonderful team, but it's all from this apartment and from like sending, receiving, writing, notes, scheduling, stuff like this. Anyway, the point is there is a disclaimer in the beginning of the book that talks about how some of the characters are composites, and it's mostly to not offend aunties and uncles. And it's true that it's the auntie and uncle characters that are composites, because I wanted to find a way to really like, I have so much respect for our parents' generation and the sacrifices they put in. Now, as any born and raised American kid who's the son of immigrants knows, auntie and uncle stories are also real fodder for comedy because of how much they put us through when we're younger. Pressure, whether it's career pressure, marital pressure. There's a line in Priyanka Chopra's book where she says something like, and I said something similar in mine. It was something like, for folks who aren't familiar, having an Indian family and having aunties and uncles who are not necessarily related by blood, on the plus side, you have all of this love and support around you. And then I think the way I describe it is in theory, because the way it can also manifest itself is you've got people who aren't even related to you telling you what you should be doing with your life. And it's like, wait, stop right there. So the purpose of creating those composites was to be able to tell those authentic stories, that the experiences themselves really happened. None of that's been embellished or changed. But I wanted to find a respectful way to make sure that aunties and uncles who have changed over time and who are incredibly supportive and kind now don't feel like I'm throwing them under the bus in an unfair way. And so, not to give away the ending of the book, but by the ending of the book, I think you also get a sense that a lot of them have also had their minds changed, thankfully.
There's always that idea as storytellers, is it my story to tell?
Yeah.
Right? It's the idea of like, whose story is it to tell? And there is that sort of council of uncles and aunties in our head that one of the questions I'd love to ask people is, when we perform, are you doing it for anyone's approval, whether subconsciously or consciously? Is this healthy? Is it not? Do we go to therapy for that? And it is sometimes when I'm up there, it is that sort of council of uncles and aunties when I was 15 or 16 in the dining room at my parents' house and wondering if they would agree or approve of my GPA or whatever it was. And they only had my best interests at heart, but I totally know what you mean. That is almost like another track in GarageBand in my inner monologue, is this uncle and auntie track.
It's true. And I'll say it also to me applied to other things. Like, this book really does dive into issues of race and misogyny and things that many of us who started in the late 90s, early 2000s saw firsthand before there was a mechanism to air certain grievances, or before those were even considered things that were not okay to do. Thankfully, we all know that times have changed. But I had to fact check this book. So I spent about 8 months calling people, some of whom I hadn't spoken to in almost a decade. And I also didn't want to put words in their mouth. So if I was trying to recount a particularly, you heard it, so you know what I'm talking about, but the issues of race are also really dynamic. I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged why racism might have been happening in certain places, and what the sort of the business acumen of the folks who were on the other end of that conversation, what they might have been thinking, and the fact that things had been very archaic in Hollywood for a long time because of the business model they use. This is still sometimes unfortunately true in network TV versus streaming. So all of which is to say, I fact-checked the hell out of this book, and calling people who I hadn't spoken to in 10 years and saying, I'm not going to tell you my take on this, but what do you remember from this particular day or this particular thing that we worked on together? And it gave me not just, it was nice that it reiterated what I had already written, and then I shared with them what I wrote and they checked out, but also getting their perspective on what happened during that time was wild to me, because I didn't know, for example, there were certain projects where I was dealing with issues of race, and I'm fact checking it with a woman who happened to be on set that day. And, she opens up to me stories about, about misogyny, and frankly, this is not my story to tell, so it's not in the book, but misogyny or groping or things that were also happening on certain sets or after certain meetings. And, there were some of these that I was able to incorporate into the book because they were part of my story, and of course got permission from the folks who were part of it. My friend Lauren Gray, who's a wonderful casting director, she was a casting assistant on a movie that I did. And it's a relatively innocuous story compared to the others, but, go in for an audition, thought it went well. Casting director then asked me to do it with a thick Indian accent, which is weird because it's like the part was written for a white dude. And accents themselves are not inherently racist. Plenty of people have accents. They're not necessarily stereotypical. It's when Hollywood tends to make them a reductionist facet of a character that's not fleshed out that you have certain issues. So of course, if somebody's asking you to do one after you've already delivered a great audition, not a good sign of that creative person's talents, I guess. But I read about how my friend Lauren Gray was the reason I was in this room, and I changed the name of the casting director who did this because he's still working today. But in talking to Lauren, I said, I'd love to tell this story. And she said, you should. She said, one of the reasons that we want to tell these stories is to sort of celebrate how things have changed and acknowledge how much further things have yet to go. So it's not just the auntie and uncle fact-checking thing. It's also the challenges that I thought I faced in my head, which turned out not to be true, are I just don't want, I don't want this book to be received for the wrong reasons. I do want to, I want to put these stories out there for in the right ways and for the right reasons. And it seems like that was maybe received that way, which is good.
My brother Rajiv Satyal is a queer author. He lives in New York with his husband. And, the point he made to me a long time ago, because of course this book also details in some degree your coming out. And he said, well, of course, and this is many years ago, he said this to me, he goes, well, of course, a lot of actors in Hollywood are gay. He goes, it's grown-up drama club. What was drama club like in high school? Of course it is. Is that a big surprise that most of us are gay? And, you didn't spend a lot of time on the gay angle, which is interesting, right? Because we know you're Indian. We've known that a while. It was really the coming out that was news to a number of people. But I can kind of understand sometimes the idea when people go, oh my gosh, you're going to get so much material. Like, you studied at UCLA. My son was just born at UCLA a few months ago, so we're very blessed with that. But sometimes people are like, oh, it's going to give you all this material. And sometimes it does. And then there are other times where, look, I'm friends with Mo Amer. He's a very funny comic. And, he is from Kuwait and he's Palestinian. He grew up in Texas. But if you watch his special, that takes about like 1 minute of his special. The rest of it is just really hilarious stuff that happened to him. So sometimes people go, there's a lot of material to mine here. Did you find, since most of your focus is on the ethnic angle versus the queer angle, that there was just more material that you were able to mine? Was it more part of your identity? Talk to that a little bit if you don't mind, because I found that really fascinating, how you talked more about racism and less about homophobia. And that's not good or bad. I was very fascinated by it.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think I was maybe a little naive in how Chapter 18, the chapter about how my partner Josh and I met and fell in love, would have been received. I think most people who have read the book and enjoyed the book know that the arc is about systems changing, and it's about what it was like growing up brown and all that. And we've been together for 11 years, and anyone who I know has met and known and had dinner and grabbed drinks with Josh. I've tried to be respectful of his privacy the same way that I've tried to be respectful of my parents and my brother's privacy. So basically, everyone in my family is incredibly private and hates the fact that I'm like this attention-seeking acting whore. So when we're, when like they've always been supportive. My parents have always come to premieres. My brother, when he's able to come to town, has obviously, since Josh and I have been together, he's come. But they all do the same sort of dance when we arrive together, and they all get out of the car and go through a side door. And they're like, we're grabbing the popcorn and the sodas and we're seeing you inside. And I'm like, can we just do one photo on the red carpet together just to like have for us? And they're always like, no, we want to go in. That's you. You can go and do the 50 interviews that you have to do to promote your little movie, and we'll see you inside. And I have to respect that. And so when I was putting the book together, and anyone who knows me also knows that those are the parents. That's Josh. That's my brother. That's what they prefer. So in putting the book together, I really wanted to, it's a memoir, and I'm so happy and excited to share how Josh and I met. It's also just a ridiculous story. Like, he comes over to my apartment with an 18-pack of Coors Light and turns the TV from SpongeBob SquarePants, which I had on, to a NASCAR race. And my first thought was, well, this dude is obviously going to leave in about 10 minutes with 16 of those beers, because this just isn't going to work out. And then, I won't give away kind of the story in the book, but it's a story that to me is about, many of us have met our significant others in ways that you first thought it's just not going to work out. I mean, so many of my buddies and their wives or friends and their husbands, it's the exact same thing. So then the book comes out, and I understand, of course, I'm happy to talk about Josh, happy to talk about my parents. But to answer your question about what that narrative was, for me, the narrative is always it's about comedy. To your point, the only reason that race even or ethnicity plays a huge role as a runner is because of the barriers to entry that we started with very early in that, right? And I wanted the whole book, whether it was talking about Josh and I or my parents or those early auditions or even working at the White House, I wanted it to be truthful to my experience. And so in answering whether it's a question about sexuality, whether it's a question about ethnicity or race or even religion or family, everyone's story is going to be completely different. And I totally respect that somebody else might write a book and the narrative might be totally different, even if we've had so many of the same shared experiences. To me, that's the beauty of how different people are different. And so I didn't want to write a book about somebody else's experience. And my experience, I think, authentically is what this book is. And I'll give you one example, which is, I also get a lot of questions about the White House, and you'll see why I'm making the comparison from Chapter 18 of the White House. So Josh and I met when I was working in DC. He was also working in DC, not in the administration. But people also often ask, what was it like working in the White House? And there's a particular section where I talk about being tasked with putting together the first ever White House Diwali celebration that a principal attended, meaning the president was actually in attendance, and the executive order that went into that. And those were things that I'm so incredibly humbled by and proud of because of all of the people that it's impacted through policy and through the fact that it's, just nice to feel like we've arrived, so to speak, if the president's hosting a Diwali. But there's a darker side to, and by darker, I mean comedically darker side, to my time there, which was that as an actor, the presumption is you probably had a skill set that helped you out at the White House. What did you take from your acting world that helped you out there? And it's the opposite for me, because I had to learn how to not be funny. And there's a story that you heard in the book that I'm going to tell the truncated version of in the interest of time, but it to me illustrates kind of the narrative of the book, which was, so I'm starting at the White House. One of my jobs is I'm the president's liaison to Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, which is why we were able to do Diwali. And it's like my second, third day, I get added to this email chain with the National Security Council. And they say, hey, Kal, or Kal Penn at the time, actually, because you use your legal name on government documents. So it was always Kal Penn. You need to know the following information because the president's meeting with a delegation from the Philippines. And it just was talking points about a terror group from the Philippines. And in government, everything is written out, and then for the rest of the email or document, it's in parentheses as an acronym. So this email says, here's some information on the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and then in parentheses it says MILF. And then for the rest of the email, it says things like MILF is considered highly dangerous. MILF often recruits young, vulnerable men. These young men grow to regret their affiliation with MILF over time. And without thinking, I just hit reply all and I said, their main terror group are the MILFs? Amazing. And as soon as I hit send, no, I didn't mean to do that. And in the hallway, first of all, nobody replies to that email, right? An hour later, one person hit reply all and said, looks like Kal Penn is in the building. And I was like, oh man. And then, but in the hallway, everyone's like, yo, dude, that was so funny. We were all thinking the same thing. Like, well, can you email back that you also thought it was funny? And they're all like, absolutely not. We're not putting that on White House email, on official government email. No way. So the reason I tell this story, and I'm not trying to distract from your very kind question about anything LGBT or anything Indian, is that my story, whether it touches on identity or not, is generally a fairly self-deprecating story about the two passions that I've had in my life so far, one of which is incredibly creative, and the other one which is driven towards public service and is a bit more serious with stakes that are a little bit different than making a stoner movie. I love both so much, and I'm so excited to take people on that journey that I wanted to do it authentically through experience rather than through something external. I wanted the person reading the book to it to feel all the feels with me, which is why that MILF story, you're at the computer with me. You have sent that email in just as a mistaken way as I have. When it's the chapter about Josh, I could have written about, the way that we each grew up, and I do that a little bit to get you into it, but then I want you to feel what it's like when somebody you're excited to meet is on a date that you feel is going terribly. Same thing with the White House chapters. There's a section on how I got the White House job and how Mrs. Obama hazed the hell out of me backstage at inauguration in front of my parents and my manager that led to getting the job. I wanted you to feel like you were there with that story instead of just telling it after the fact. So very long-winded way of answering your question, but that's kind of why I put the book together the way I did.
I love it. No, long-winded. I would not call that long-winded. I'd say that's very entertaining. Long-winded implies that it was boring and we're checked out. No, I felt like I was right there with you during your answer, as well as when you were writing the book or when I was listening to it, which is really incredible. I really wish that maybe to stock MILF they would have had like Cougar or something like that. That would have been incredible. Like,
Missed opportunity. Maybe a competing terror group can start that.
look, another thing that you talk about is applying to a lot of schools. You applied to 16. I think I tied or broke my school record in Ohio when I applied to 19 schools, and I thought that was such a cool thing. And my guidance counselor, just like yours, he was really great, but I was like, maybe focus. Do the thing where you're supposed to apply to 2 dream schools, 2 that you would go to, and 2 safety schools. And I know you in your book you talk about how one of the guys, I think one of your friends, his backup or something was Harvard or it was MIT or.
It was like Hopkins. I think it was John Hopkins for
Johns Hopkins. Yeah, Johns Hopkins.
Such a like child of aunties and uncles, right? Where you all go around the room. This would happen regularly at every family gathering. You're between the ages of like 8th grade and senior year, and it's with love, right? The parents and the aunties and uncles asking what everybody's up to and where they're applying to school, and just it was everyone like, I'm applying to Rutgers pre-med. I'm applying to Harvard, uncle, but my safety's Hopkins. I'm like, your safety is John Hopkins.
That's like Rushmore. Harvard's my safety.
Yeah, it's right. So,
are they?
When you're the creative kid, I can, and I think did say my dream schools are, the top 3 theater and film schools, NYU, UCLA, and that doesn't sit the same way. Even though they know later, like, wow, that's an incredibly competitive program to get into globally. That's you feel like you're overcompensating when you explain it. But when you're 16, the frustration of like, how come this auntie doesn't understand that this is, okay, there's Harvard Medical School, and then there's this film school, which is the global version of the Harvard Medical School for film that only takes like 50 people a year. How come that doesn't have the same sense of importance? That's obviously been changing over time, but it was tough. One thing we don't talk about very much that I did in the book for this reason is how sometimes within our own community, we're not as supportive as I think we could or should be. And I found that to be the case during my college years from other Brown folks, like other Nacies on campus.
Geeta and Ravi on campus.
You remembered their names. Those names obviously have been changed to protect the guilty.
I assume that wasn't Ravi Patel and his sister. I'm like, wow, he really threw them under the bus. I'm like, I know it's not them. So.
Oh my gosh. No, they're both so wonderful.
I know.
Yeah, these kids in my dorm who would, and it's silly now, obviously, to look back and be like, that was so stupid. But at the time it affects you. The only 2 brown kids on my dorm floor who would say things like, you're such a sellout. Your parents must be so disappointed in you. Why don't you major in biology? Things that like, at the time I'm like, are you like a tiny auntie and uncle? Like, what is happening here? So it was that sort of thing where I didn't feel supported by the community early on. It really wasn't until like American Desi came out or projects like that. So a few years after college, really, that I started to feel that things might be changing from within the community.
That movie really, honestly, brought me in because I felt a lot like you, Cal. I did not relate to a lot of the brown kids. Most of my friends are white. And when I saw American Desi, that was the one that I think everyone in our generation saw. And that touched me. I cried in it, man. I really thought it was a super touching and also hilarious movie. And that's really how I got to know you as an actor. And I admire that you're willing to engage in so many conversations. You talk about you can't let your passion and emotion get the best of you. And you detail all these ways where these days people are like, well, I'm not your ambassador. It's not my job to educate you. It seems like you've taken the opposite tack, which is like, maybe that isn't my job, but I'm going to move people who may just be living in ignorance versus willful ignorance. And I'm glad you call out the difference in those two as well. You dichotomize those so well. Was there a time, though, where you melted down and just went off on somebody? Because I feel like there must have been, as actors and performers, there must have been something that got to you where you were like, oh my gosh, this was just too much.
No, that happens all the time, right? I don't think it's one or the other. I think that the reason I describe it that way in the book is like the reality is whether we, I think it was Mira Nair, I might be getting this wrong, but I think she years ago had said, she's so not a fan of cultural ambassadorship, meaning why should I be the one who gets to litigate what it means or doesn't mean to be South Asian? I remember, there's so many friends of ours in the progressive South Asian community who will say things like, well, Republican progressives are not, Republican Desi progressives aren't really Desi. I'm like, well, what a silly thing to say. To me, that reminds me of being in college and Geeta and Ravi saying you're such a sellout because you're not majoring in theater. Like, who are you to litigate my South Asianness? And by the same token, who are we to litigate that somebody who we disagree with politically is somehow inherently less South Asian? That's not our choice to make. So that's what I mean in a lot of those conversations where I say the reality is that people will always say things like that, but it's an opportunity, I think, to, if you want things to change, sometimes you're forced to have conversations that you'd rather not have. That's just the reality of whether you want things to change. And sometimes you just need to vent. I talk about how Twitter is not a good use of anyone's political time, but sometimes you need to pull this out and say something nasty to the person who you don't like, and it just feels good. That's it. So I don't think it's one or the other. I just think, that they can be one and the same. There are plenty of times where I lost it and yelled, and there are plenty of times where I just kind of did it in a lot more of a diabolical way, like the story I tell about Son of the Mask with that awful director who really, really wanted an Indian accent, and he obviously was not very creative or very funny. But I noticed that he had 2 large hearing aids. And so I realized he wasn't going to be able to hear whether I was doing the accent or not. So I didn't do a thick accent. And instead, I made my eyes really big and did this minstrel shit that I knew he would think, because he's this white dude, that he would think that I was doing the Indian accent he wanted, because so many white people had asked me to do that minstrel nonsense before. And I finished the movie that way. And it wasn't until post-production that the studio was like, hey, we need you to dub all your lines with a thick Indian accent. And I obviously didn't do that. And I got my way out of that also. But so there are times where the reason that I try to lean into how to solve a problem instead of being angry is that anger then I think takes away from it just takes away from your own opportunity and your own energy. There's a woman when I was at UCLA, I think she was the only Black woman on network TV. I saw her at like UCLA and SAG did a panel together, and somebody said, how do you deal with rejection? And she said, I am a classically trained actor with an MFA. I think she had it from Yale or something. She said, if, I know when I go into the room, if they're going to not cast me and instead cast, the blonde woman from Iowa who has no credits and no training, they know why they did that. And they know it wasn't because I wasn't good enough, because I was 1,000 times more qualified. And I thought, what an interesting way to answer that question. This woman has I'm sure she's had bad days. I'm sure she's been livid, but instead she's taking that energy and using it with the knowledge that she's always going to have to work 1,000 times harder to get in the room. That's just the reality. So I sort of said to myself, whatever that reality is, I'm going to have bad days. I'm going to waste energy. I'm going to yell and scream, but I'm going to try to move that energy towards something that'll help me, my career, and my dreams.
I love that, and I love how she wanted them to know that was the reason, right? That she knows they know it, but she wants to make sure they know it. And I loved how you articulated that. In the book, you talk about, hey, which accent? Scottish, whatever. So I want to give you, Kal Penn, a chance to give me an accent, because now I'm dying to hear you do such great voices in the book, but I want to hear a really great another dialect you could do, so we can prove to all those white people you could do more than just an Indian accent.
I will tell you, there are voices in the book, and you're asking this at a time right before the holidays when there was a movie I have a cameo in called Deck the Halls. And I remember showing up to work that day, and the director expected me to have an Indian accent. I was playing a reporter or something. Like, why would he have an Indian accent in a Christmas movie where he's playing a reporter? It's like, oh, because it's so funny. And then I did that thing. I was like, I can do any accent you want, British, Scottish, Brooklyn, Irish. And he goes, oh, British seems fun. Just any accent. I was like, oh, is this progress or is it? I'm not quite sure, but whatever it is. And it was like, to be fair, not a great British accent, okay? Usually as an actor, as you know from my terrible British accent just now, you take a month, you prep, you listen to the tapes, and you crush it, because that's your job. Of course I can do accents. But that one, you're reminding me at a time when that movie, every Christmas, that and the Harold and Kumar Christmas movie tend to come out around the same time. So I appreciate that.
You will live on and on whenever an artist has a Christmas take. You know, Elvis, Blue Christmas. The rest generations forever will know Deck the Halls and the Harold and Kumar installment. I know you got to run. I want to wish you, the best, Kal Penn. In Moneyball, they say the first guy through the wall always gets bloody. You were the first guy for a lot of us, and the stories that you tell, the pain that you have to absorb, that you then spun into something that was hilarious and heartwarming, has done such a service to our community and beyond. So thank you for being a pioneer. Congratulations to you and Josh. I hope Cardi B does officiate your wedding. Kal, thanks, man. I really appreciate this, for real.
I'm glad we finally got to do this. Hopefully next time in person.
And thank you, everybody, for joining me on What Do You Bring to the Table? I've been your host, Rajiv, and I still am.